Delighted to have everybody here to hear the presentation by Dr. Paul Finkelman, the Ariel F. Sallows Visiting Professor of Human Rights at the University of Saskatchewan. As all of you know, here and our colleagues and friends in Regina, the Johnson Sama Graduate School of Public Policy is a two-campus institution. The wonderful benefit of that is we sort of double the fun and double the access to wonderful students, wonderful faculty members. The downside is we're very much dependent on new technology. So every time you get excited about the idea of remote surgery and having your kidney transplant done by somebody in Thailand, I want you to remember what it was like today watching us try to simply set up a contact between Regina and the University of Saskatchewan. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a professor at Johnson Sama Graduate School of Public Policy here at the University of Saskatchewan. I am the moderator here at this end for today. Shara Camillo is going to wave to us because she's going to prove that we can hear her down there. So Cheryl is our moderator in the Regina campus. What you'll see later on is when we get to the question period, we'll alternate questions between the Saskatoon campus and the Regina campus. And those of you who are students, we're grading all of you, so you have to each have at least 5 questions ready to go when we get to that particular part. I'm delighted here to welcome today my friend Paul Finkelman, who's been visiting here since January. Not very many people come and start their visiting professorship in January, but Paul's not a normal person. And so he's come here since January. He's going to be here over the course of the fall as well. Paul is a really, truly remarkable individual. You can go on Wikipedia and read everything you want to know about Paul, written in wonderful, dramatic way. I know that because Paul, one of his many sidelights is he actually has a company that does Wikipedia entries, which is clearly one of his own. and Paul is a terrific, well-known scholar. He has degrees from Syracuse University and University of Chicago. He's one of the best published scholars in America on American legal history. A superb expert on slavery in particular, has written extensively in a whole variety of formats on slavery. He's an historian, not a lawyer. But he has nonetheless played a very, very active role in American jurisprudence. His work has been cited favorably, I should add, by U.S. Supreme Court on 3 different occasions. He was involved in some very important legal cases, including one involving prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and an even more important one that had to do with Barry Bonds' baseball from his record-setting home run, which I think is an interesting sort of process by itself. Paul has retired a couple of years ago, but he hasn't slowed down at all. He has held positions all across North America and obviously here in Canada. He's been a distinguished speaker at universities all around the world. He has a series of 35 books that he has published on a whole bunch of topics, mostly American legal history, a lot of them dealing with slavery and its issues and what have you. He's also a very active commentator on American public affairs. He was the only person in Canada disappointed when Ted Cruz was not the successful nominee for the Republican Party, because he was preparing a legal case in the fact that Ted Cruz, who was actually born in Canada, was not eligible to be the President of the United States. And as soon as Cruz was defeated, his access to Oprah Winfrey disappeared almost overnight. Paul is a delightful scholar, a really talented individual, and a highly regarded speaker. I'm delighted to introduce to you Paul Finkelman.
Thank you, Ken. I have no idea who he's talking about. The one thing I do want to say is, although I am teaching at the law school, I am in fact not an attorney. I'm a historian, although I consider myself to be a legal scholar. But what today we are going to talk about is the fun and festivities just south of the border. If you head, about 400 kilometers south of here, you get to Gaga Land, and you can watch the presidential election either on TV or drive down and see it in action. And what I want to talk about is the bizarre process by which Americans choose their president, and I think this is, of course, centrally important to Canadians. As Mr. Trump talks about building walls, if I were a Canadian, I'd be building a brick factory on the off chance that the Canada might want to build a wall as well. And aside from that sort of attempted humor, I think it is seriously important to understand what is going on in the United States, because obviously it affects Canada. Canada's greatest trading partner is the United States. And by the way, the United States has a major trading partner in Canada. For all of the noise in this election about NAFTA and Mexico, most Americans, especially I think Mr. Trump, simply do not comprehend that the United States has 10 times as much trade with Canada as it does with Mexico. And if all of the trade with Mexico and the United States disappeared, it would probably not even be noticeable in terms of the volume of the American economy. If the Canadian trade disappeared, it would be a significant factor because it's 10 times larger. And that's just one way in which I think even though you can't vote, although as my good friend pointed out, Ken said, you can run for president if you're Canadian. You can't vote. Nevertheless, there is, I think, an enormous stake in what happens that will affect Canada, as well, of course, will affect the rest of the world, because whether anyone likes it or not, the United States remains, the biggest dog in the yard. It is the mover and shaker of much of the world, sometimes for good, sometimes for less good, but it is there and it has to be dealt with. So the first thing I want to do is explain the nature of how you get a presidential candidate. Because if you are watching Canadian politics, you're scratching your head and thinking, what are these Americans up to and how does this work? In Canada, you have a very clear party system. You have a very clear parliamentary system in which the person who is able to organize parliament gets to be prime minister. And the very name prime minister is different from president in the sense that the prime minister is the first minister among many, many equals who are also ministers. And the reality is that under some circumstances, we could wake up tomorrow morning and discover that there is no longer another Trudeau in the prime minister's office, because at any given moment, the ministry can fall. It's unlikely. It doesn't happen very often. But if you ask the recent Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he'll tell you it can happen. You'll lose an election. You call a referendum, perhaps stupidly call a referendum. You put your party's line on the referendum. You lose the referendum. And guess what? You're unemployed, at least as Prime Minister, right away. So in that sense, the Canadian system is really quite different than the American, because the only way you can remove a president from office is by an elaborate process known as impeachment. Impeachment is very difficult. It takes first you need a majority of the House of Representatives to impeach that, and the impeachment is essentially a political indictment. And once you have indicted the president, he is then tried before the United States Senate, and you need a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate, which is not easy to get. There are 100 senators, so you need 67 senators to vote for conviction. The standard for impeachment is fairly high. The standard is that the president must commit high crimes or misdemeanors or fail to faithfully execute the office of president. And an example in the Constitution of what impeachment is that it's treason, bribery, or other high crimes. So these are in fact not crimes of an individual nature, but the standard for impeachment would be a crime against the political system, a crime against the Constitution. And of course, it would also be plausible that one could be impeached without doing anything that would in fact resemble a crime. To give a kind of simple example, one that's far-fetched, of course, it's unlikely to happen, but you never know. Saskatchewan decides that it really does need more room because the population is getting crowded here. So the Canadians get together and decide they're going to seize North Dakota. And so the Canadian Army masses on the border, invades North Dakota. If any of you have ever been to North Dakota, you'd of course say, why? There's a lot of oil there, and Saskatchewan wants to have as much oil as Alberta, so you decide you're going to invade North Dakota. And the President of the United States looks at the map and says, North Dakota never voted for me. I don't like North Dakota anyways. Who cares? And so the Canadian Army marches into North Dakota, seizes North Dakota, and the President of the United States does nothing about it. I would argue that that would be an impeachable offense because he has failed to protect and defend the Constitution, which is his oath. He has failed to uphold his responsibilities as president. And so one could imagine an impeachable offense that it is not actually a criminal offense. On the other hand, if the president has 25 speeding tickets, that's not an impeachable offense, even if it might rise to him losing his driver's license and having to pay lots of fines, etc. So I hope you understand the difference. But in the comparison between Canada and the U.S., of course, the significant difference is that the president can't be removed simply because the winds of politics are blowing in the other direction. We have, again, a peculiar system of elections where every 4 years we elect a president, but every 2 years we have what we call midterm elections. And in the midterm elections, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, and 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election. So one could imagine a president getting elected, and 2 years later, 90% of the House of Representatives is turned over, and the other party now absolutely controls the House of Representatives. Sort of like when the Conservatives were in power one day, and the next day, if I'm correct on this, they had 2 people left in the Canadian Parliament. This was about 15, 20 years ago, right? So one could imagine, let's to take a scenario that Hillary Clinton is elected president, and 2 years from now, 400 of the 435 members of the House are elected Republicans. Mrs. Clinton is still president because there is no changeover, because we have essentially a tripartite government system that is interconnected but not dependent on each other. So we have an independent judiciary, an independent legislature, an independent president. That makes right away the American system really quite different from Canadian. The other way, of course, it's quite different is that your leaders come up generally through the party. That is to say, the party professionals, the people who are involved in the political party, choose who the party leader is going to be. And when a parliamentary election comes, you set out that the Conservatives or the Progressive, are they still Progressive? I don't know. The Conservatives are going to run so-and-so. The NDP is running so-and-so. The Liberals are running so-and-so. Is the Social Credit Party still out here? I don't think so. But, they're I love Canadian politics. And I really do. I grew up on the border, so I grew up watching Canadian politics. I was, in fact, my first awareness of a Canadian leader was Prime Minister Diefenbaker, which, of course, also dates me. So in Canada, the party chooses the leader, and invariably, although it's not impossible to imagine otherwise, invariably the party leader is somebody who actually has some political sophistication and some political knowledge and some political experience. I don't say it would be impossible for Canada to come up with a reality TV show star to be the leader of a major party, but it does seem unlikely. Now, I guess it would be possible for that to happen as the mayor of Toronto, but not as a national political figure. So in that sense, the process is very different. So how does the American process work? Well, the 2 major parties hold what are called primaries. And the primaries are essentially 50 separate elections because each state has a primary. And in fact, a few territories like Guam and Puerto Rico also have primaries. And although they can't vote in the presidential election, each of those places send a few delegates to the national conventions. So but for practical purposes, we imagine 50 separate elections, each election by people who are voting in one of the party primaries. And every state has both a different system of running the party primary and a different system of eligibility for who can vote in the party primary. So, for example, in South Carolina, you can walk in on the day of the election if you are a registered voter and say, I'm voting in the Republican primary, or I'm voting in the Democratic primary, because there's no pre-party allegiance. And in fact, I was involved in as an expert witness in a lawsuit a few years ago because a group of Republicans in South Carolina were trying to get rid of what's called the open primary, precisely because significant numbers of blacks who live in South Carolina were voting in the Republican primary, not because they planned to vote in the Republican in the general elections, but because they wanted to make sure that the least offensive Republicans were nominated at the local level. South Carolina is a very weird state where, with the exception of one congressional district, the state is almost entirely Republican. And it's also, in terms of voting, the most racially polarized place in the United States. So that the African Americans in South Carolina are essentially 98% Democrats, and the whites in South Carolina are probably 75% Republicans. So there's this. So in South Carolina, you get these weird primaries where large numbers of black Democrats vote in the Republican primary to try and influence, not necessarily the presidential campaign, but who gets to run for U.S. Senate, or who gets to run for governor, or who is the legislator from your particular district. And there were a group of disgruntled Republicans who were suing to overturn this because they were possibly the most popular people in their party, but they had not gotten the nomination because a more moderate person, a less Trump-like person essentially, got the nomination because of all these allegedly black Democrats voting against them. So that's one nature of primary. On the other hand, in New York State, where I vote, you have to register. When you register to vote, you indicate which party you are in. So you say, I'm a registered Republican, I'm a registered Democrat. There are about 12 parties in New York. And you can choose which party you are going to be a member of. What happened in this last set of primaries, for example, is that Bernie Sanders' supporters come out to vote for him in the New York primary, and they get to vote. They get up to the polling place and they say, well, you can't vote. And they said, well, why can't we vote? We're registered voters. And they said, yes, but you are not registered Democrats. And you can't vote in the Democratic primary unless you're actually a member of the Democratic Party. You are not a member of the Democratic Party. And so if you watch the news the night after the New York primary, there were all these Sanders supporters who, up until this moment in their lives, had never been active in politics, did not understand politics, probably didn't understand how elections actually work. And they're saying, we were disfranchised, we were denied our right to vote. No, you weren't denied your right to vote. You were registered to vote for the independent party candidate, because you registered as an independent. And so, again, it depends on which state you're in. And these, of course, what I'm describing now, are simply election primaries. Then there are the caucuses. And the caucuses are completely different as well, because the caucuses mean that on a particular day, all the people aligned with a party, whether it's an open primary or a pre-registered primary, you go to the caucus for your primary. So everybody who's a Democrat in Des Moines, Iowa, goes to various party caucuses around Des Moines, Iowa, and they meet to decide who's going to be the candidate from that system. I was actually 3 times a delegate to the Texas Democratic Convention many, many years ago. And the way the process worked for me is I went to my precinct where I voted. After we had a primary election. The primary election is what's called a beauty contest. It didn't matter. It was simply collecting votes, so it was bragging rights, right? The only thing that mattered is what happened after the primary election closed when you had the caucus. So the polls closed at 5 o'clock, and at 5:15, you had the caucus. And I walked into the caucus. This was the first time I'd ever been involved in politics. I figured out how the system worked. I went up and down my block, and I got 12 friends to come with me. And I said, hey, I want to go to the party convention. Will you come with me to the caucus? So we walked in, 12 of us. I controlled my caucus because I had 12 people. There were only about 40 people in the room. And what was fascinating is I was opposed to another person in the Democratic Party who is now a Texas state senator, and she was sort of rising star in the local party, and she thought she was going to come in and control things, and I completely destroyed her in this. It's probably her only loss in politics, because since then she's had a very good career. But she didn't plan for the notion that there would be somebody who wasn't a party insider who's coming in with a block of 12 votes, which was enough to kind of turn it my way. So I got elected. So I was elected to the county convention, and then at the county convention, all of the people from my precinct caucused, and we elected 2 people to the state convention. And then we went to the state convention. And then all of the people from our congressional district caucused in the state convention to elect 2 delegates or 3 delegates to the national convention. So it's a kind of a slowly going up. You can understand why people scratch their heads and wonder, how does this system work? What is going on? And again, in some states, you have to be pre-registered to be in the caucuses. In other states, like when I was in Texas, you didn't. So if Republicans had wanted, they could have come and voted in the Democratic primary. And you could imagine a caucus where everybody thinks they're a Democrat, but suddenly there's 40 Republicans in your caucus, and all chaos breaks out. So that's the process that leads to a national convention. In addition to this process, as a way of immunizing the parties from the rabble, which would be one way of putting it, as a way of immunizing the parties from people who aren't professionals, there are also a series of what are known as superdelegates. Superdelegates are, in effect, people who automatically get a seat at the national convention based on the position they hold. So, for example, every state governor is automatically a delegate to his or her party convention. Every member of the House of Representatives, both the Republicans and the Democrats have this. So if you are a Republican member of the House of Representatives, you are automatically a delegate from your state to the national convention. So if you again followed the nomination of Mrs. Clinton, you would see things like elected delegates versus superdelegates, because of course what Bernie Sanders argued as being an outsider was that the system's rigged against me because Clinton has all the superdelegates. But as it turns out, Clinton, if there were no superdelegates, Clinton still wins the nomination. If there's superdelegates, she still wins the nomination. And here's the final weirdness of all this, right? Bernie Sanders is not now, nor ever has been, actually a member of the Democratic Party. So if you could imagine somebody who is a lifelong NDPer walking into the Liberal Party and saying, hey, you should nominate me to be the guy to run for prime minister because I'm better than the insider who's a member of your party. And this is, again, one of the weirdnesses of the American political system. I've been talking for a while now. Do you have any questions? Anybody have any questions? Please feel free. This is, not a formal lecture. This is a small room. Nothing.
So I just want to be clear on the caucus. There's a caucus that happens at every stage in the convention stage, from county to state.
If you are in a caucus state, yes.
Okay. Oh, so not every.
But you see, if you have the direct primary. So I'll give you again. In New York State, you walk into the voting booth and you have a ballot. And the ballot, the Democratic Party ballot would have said Hillary Clinton, Bernard Sanders, 5 or 6 other people, none of whom any of us knows who they are, but they wanted them I mean, I've sort of thought, someday I'll run for president, and so I can have my name on a ballot somewhere, right? 5 or 6 other people, and you can vote for one of them, and then it will have below that lists of names who are people running as delegates. So delegates pledged to Hillary Clinton, delegates pledged to Bernie Sanders, delegates, okay? And so if you're the national candidate, you have to recruit delegates in every congressional district for yourself. And in fact, to give you again the idea of how complicated all this becomes, in 2008, when Mrs. Clinton was running for the first time for president against Barack Obama, one of the last primaries was the Pennsylvania primary. And the Pennsylvania primary was a direct primary. So you voted for delegates and you voted for, the candidate you want. Mrs. Clinton never bothered to recruit a full slate of delegates across Pennsylvania because in her hubris, her arrogance, her expectation that she would be the winner, she assumed that by the time the Pennsylvania primary came up, it would all be over and she would have won. Well, it was in fact all over and she'd already lost. So she did not, if there had been a hope that somehow she might turn around the convention in 2008, one of the hopes was dashed by the fact that even where people wanted to vote for her in the Democratic primary in Pennsylvania, they couldn't because she didn't have delegates. Was there another question? Yeah.
So how many times in the 4-year period before they elect a president where the average American voter voted?
Okay. All right. So if you are a good citizen, and by that I mean that you participate in, and by the way, for all of the differences, the one thing that Canada and the U.S. both have is that we have a democratic system of choosing our government, and that's what makes the two countries far more similar than different. We may have different process, but the important thing is that the voters vote. So how often would you vote in the U.S.? So you have a presidential election every 4th year in a year divisible by 4. The other way to look at it is if it's a leap year, it's also a presidential leap year. It's also a Summer Olympics year. So these things all come about at once. I'm actually waiting to figure out whether some political scientist can predict outcomes of presidential elections based on how many medals the U.S. wins in the Summer Olympics. Whether that helps the Republicans or the Democrats. There are people who, and of course, for those of you who are doing statistics and political science, it's always important to understand the difference between correlation and actually mattering. So there may be a correlation, but it has no other significance. But anyways, so you have the presidential election. So it's 2016. In 2016, you would have voted in the primary sometime in the spring, presidential primary. Now, just to make your head explode a little more, in some states, there would also be a state and local election primary later in the year. So, for example, I was back in New York in August, and I voted absentee for the New York Democratic primary for local and state elections, which was separate from the presidential primary last spring. Okay, so conceivably we could have, if we're doing 2016, you vote in the presidential primary, you vote in your state and local primary, which might be a different day, it might not. In some states, by the way, the Republican and Democratic primaries are not on the same day, so the Republicans all vote one day, the Democrats all vote the next day. Then you have the general election in November. And in the general election, all of the candidates, so that it will be U.S. House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, if there's a senator from your state up for re-election, the president, state and local offices, your state assembly, your state senator, your mayor, your city council, all of those, that would be on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So it's the earliest it could be is November 2nd, the latest it could be is November 8th. because the first day of the month is a Tuesday, so you have to wait till the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Why they chose that is beyond me, but that's how it works. Okay, so that would be 2016. In 2017, depending on what state you live in, there may be other elections. There may be local elections in 2017. In some states, they've contrived to have the governor's election not be in a year when there is either a presidential election or a state senator's election. So in some states, there might be a governor's election in 2017. There may be local offices, and I don't know enough about local Canadian politics, but in the U.S. there are places where there are infinite numbers of local offices. Literally everything from mayor to dog catcher. And we have people who are elected to local offices that in the rest of the world, people might scratch their head and wonder why. For example, the coroner, the county coroner, is an elected office. Now, I would think that to be the elected county coroner, you ought to know something about dead bodies. You ought to know something about science. You ought to know something about biology, but you don't have to. You can simply be the county coroner, and then you hire people to do literally the dirty work. The sheriff is an elected official. It's not somebody who is necessarily a law enforcement person. The county attorney is an elected official. In much of the United States, we have local elected judges. So that would be the off year. Then 2018, we're going to have the U.S. House of Representatives is up for re-election, and 1/3 of the Senate will be up for re-election. And then 2019, I don't know. And then 2020, we're back to a presidential election. The Board of Elections is a busy place. They're always either counting ballots or waiting for the next election. Now, at one level, you could argue that this is really a very democratic way of running a country, that the people are closer to their elected officials than in other countries because we have so many elected officials and so we have so many offices. The alternative way of looking at it is because there are so many offices and so many elected officials that the average voter has no idea who they're voting for most of the time, and they are and they are really at the mercy of professional politicians or sometimes extremely ideological groups of people who run a slate of officers. For example, in many states, the state school board is elected. And in some states where there is a very strong opposition to what I would call the modern world, such as people who are opposed to the teaching of evolution, people who believe evolution has never happened, they have in some states run a whole slate of people to be the state school board. This happened in Kansas a few years ago, and the new school board got elected. The first thing they do is said, we can no longer teach evolution in the public schools of Kansas. So much for kids from Kansas ever becoming petroleum geologists because they're not going to be able to figure out how it works. And these kinds of issues, again, complicate politics. Politics is both very, very local and national at the same time. Does that help? Yeah, that's right. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes, sir. A fellow New Yorker.
I'm from Africa.
I'm out of the camera. I see. Yes, but you have New York on your shirt, so.
Yes,
Africa's a big place. Any particular part of Africa? Where are you from?
Nigeria.
Okay, Nigeria.
Yes. When you were presenting, you made mention of the fact that potential voters will have to indicate.
Could you talk a little louder?
You made mention of the fact that potential voters will have to indicate the party they
Right.
want to vote for at the point of registration.
Right.
So I want to ask, what if after having chosen Democrats, for instance, that I would vote for Democrats during the election, and at the point I realized that Democrats is no longer my way. I want to vote for.
Okay, so, all right, so what you would do, the question is, if you're registered as a Democrat and you decide I don't want to be voting in the Democratic primary,
Yes.
you have to go to the Board of Elections and change your party registration. Okay? Now, in most states, there is a time limit on when you can do this. So you can't change your party registration the day before the election. You might have to change it a month before or 2 months before. Part of this is an anti-corruption concept. That is, you're a good Democrat and I'm running in the Republican primary, and I come to you and I say, look, I need some more votes. Here's $100. Will you go register Republican and vote for me? And so the idea of, there have been times in the U.S., shocking as it is, when people were paid for their votes. So part of the long-term registration, part of you can't change your party affiliation the day before the election, is to prevent that kind of corruption. I should add one other thing, that party registration is not secret. Party registration is public information. So I can go to the Board of Elections and get a list of all of the registered Democrats or registered Republicans. I had an uncle who lived in a county that was very, very Republican. He never voted Republican a day in his life. He was a registered Republican because he understood that if he was a registered Democrat, it would hurt his business. So now that's not a legal issue, but it is a function of the way politics really works. I suspect that might be true in Saskatchewan, which is mostly, with the exception of one member of parliament, I gather, mostly a one-party province. And so where you have one party that dominates the province, you often, or the state or the locality, you often get people who are nominally in that party, but in fact that's not how they vote, because the voting is secret. Yes?
Do you think all of this is a barrier to participation?
Well, the question is this a barrier to participation? It shouldn't be a barrier to participation. That is to say, registering to vote in most places in the United States is a very simple process. In about half the states, when you get your driver's license, you can also register to vote. So 18-year-olds go get their driver's license and they sign up their voter registration card. In many states, there will be tables out on the mall at a university, and you fill out your voter registration card, and the people who are running the voter registration drive take the cards to the county, and you're registered to vote. The barrier comes in those places where the political elite or the political majority would like to suppress the vote of certain groups. Usually this is racial or ethnic. So that in the Deep South, where there is still this long legacy of slavery and segregation and racism, and that's the only way to call it. This is what it is about. There are persistent attempts to suppress black voting, usually by weird registration rules, most recently by voter ID rules. I have never had to show, I've lived I voted probably in a half a dozen states. I've never had to show an ID to vote. When you register to vote, you show your ID, you sign a form, and when I go to vote, they have my signature in front of me. I sign my signature. They see it's the same signature. They ask me if what my address is. I tell them the correct address, and I vote. So the creation of voter ID laws has been a way of suppressing the vote by claiming what we're trying to do is prevent voter fraud. But what they're really trying to do is to prevent people from voting. And here's how some of the creative things work. The state of Georgia, which of course had the second largest number of slaves in the U.S. in 1860, and was a long-term segregating state. The state of Georgia passed a voter ID law about 15 years ago in which they said that the only way you could vote is if you could show a valid driver's license. or a card issued by the motor vehicle department, which was not a valid driver's license, but a motor vehicle ID card, right? However, at the same time that the state did that, it closed down a couple of the motor vehicle offices in the city of Atlanta, which is a mostly black city. Furthermore, of course, in a city like Atlanta, you can live very well without a car at all because there's very good public transportation. New York City, probably half the people in the city don't have a driver's license. Why would you want one? It's just an expense. The state of Alabama did it this year. They created, again, a system where you had to have a state ID, and then they closed the motor vehicle offices in 6 counties, which were largely rural and largely black. So there's a constant fight against this kind of discrimination, and there's constant, litigation. Most of these states are losing these cases. The most interesting was in Indiana about 10 years ago, there was a voter ID law passed. It went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is our second level courts, and the opinion was written by a Reagan appointee to the Court of Appeals, a very conservative man named Richard Posner, who's also a very distinguished judge. I know Judge Posner. And Judge Posner wrote an opinion saying that there's not any evidence at all that this is racially motivated. This is purely anti-fraud. And about 10 years later, another voter ID case came before him, and he said, I was wrong in the previous case. I was misled by the arguments. I was misled by the attorney for the state. This is clearly discrimination. So you have a federal judge who switched on the merits. So I don't think requiring registration is necessarily a voter suppression law. What's voter suppression is when the process that you do it and the motivation is to suppress, and then it limits voting. The other way to look at it would be, and by the way, some states have same-day registration. So there are states where you can walk in and say, hey, I've decided I want to vote in the presidential election. What do I do? And they say, you stand on that line, get registered. You stand on that line and you vote. But I don't think it's a huge burden to tell somebody there's an election coming up in 2 years and you need to get registered to vote. There is a sort of a requirement, I suppose, that citizens be active in their own self-governance. Let me take your question, and then I'm going to go on to the next phase of things.
What is the time frame between the time the registration will end and the time of actual election?
Well, it varies. I mean, in some states you have to be registered a month before the election. In other states you have to be, as I said, you have same-day registration. In some states it varies by state. By the way, once you're registered forever. That is, I don't have to re-register as long as I continue voting. If I'm registered and I don't vote for 4 or 5 elections, then the Board of Elections will preliminarily take me off the registration list on the assumption that I have moved, that I am dead, that I am no longer capable of voting in elections. Every year or every other year, I get a postcard from the Board of Elections saying, are you still at this address? If not, please let us know. And I don't have to do anything. It's a default system, but presumably that postcard would be forwarded to a forwarding address. So the idea is to keep the election rolls clean. Obviously, the more complicated the registration system, the more opportunity there is for political parties to manipulate them. When I lived in Chicago many, many years ago, one of the newspapers did a survey of who was registered to vote, and they discovered that there were like 40 people registered at the address of Wrigley Field where the Chicago Cubs play, and another 40 or 50 people registered for the address at Soldier Field where the Chicago Bears play football. The assumption was these people don't actually exist, but rather this is vote fraud by the party. Okay, let me move on now from how you get nominated to how you get elected, because this is an equally strange and complicated process. Do you have a question for Regina?
I'll let you know.
Okay, all right. So we will have a general election on November 8th, and everyone in the country who votes will go into a voting booth or vote absentee, and they will choose their candidate. You will vote for Donald Trump, you will vote for Hillary Clinton, you will vote for one of the many third-party candidates, none of whom have any chance whatsoever of getting elected president, although one of them, the Libertarian Party candidate, has an outside possibility that he will carry one or two states. And I can talk about that in a little bit. But by and large, it is a two-candidate election. And while the third party, we call all of the other candidates third parties, so there's like 8 or 9 third parties. But the third party candidates always say, exercise your choice, vote for me. They are basically on a gigantic ego trip most of the time. They like to see their picture on TV. They like to see their name in the paper. Or they are politically trying to make an important point about the nature of politics, knowing full well that they will not get elected. That is, they are offering themselves up to those people who really don't care about the outcome of the election, but want to register their political views. To give you a good example of this, in 1844, a long time ago, but it's the same process, a former slave owner named James G. Birney ran for president on the Liberty Party ticket. James G. Birney had freed all his slaves. He'd become an active abolitionist. And he basically said, vote for me because both of these parties are pro-slavery. It's a pro-slavery country. If you think slavery is all that matters, I'm your candidate. And James G. Birney got 5,000 votes in the state of New York. And the winning candidate beat the losing candidate by about 2,000 votes. So presumably Birney may have changed the outcome of the New York election from one candidate to the other. Of course, since both candidates happen to be slave owners, it's arguable to believe that if Birney had not been running, none of his 5,000 voters would have voted for anyone because they were committed to anti-slavery. So you do get these kind of single-issue parties that are, you get an anti-nuclear party, et cetera, et cetera. But by and large, it's going to be a two-party election, and I'm going to hold you on the edge of your seat to get back to that, to take a question from Regina.
Question from Regina: do superdelegate votes carry any more weight than other delegates at the national conventions?
No, the superdelegate votes have the exact same. You see me this way, or did they see me this way? This way. Okay. The superdelegates. This is so bizarre. The superdelegate votes have the same number of votes as anybody else. The point is that you know who the superdelegates are in advance, and you can woo them and recruit them for your cause. Okay. Other questions? Okay. All right. So you'll go into the voting booth and you will vote. You will vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, but you will in fact not vote for either of those two people. You will vote for a slate of presidential electors who are pledged to those people. And so now I have to explain to you the Electoral College. And I have 30 minutes to do it. I think I can do it in about 10. So and that will give us more time for questions. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates are perplexed as to how to choose the national leader, the president. The father of the Constitution, the most important delegate, is a man named James Madison from Virginia. And James Madison says in debate that the most appropriate thing, he says the fittest thing in classical 18th century language, he says the most appropriate thing would be for the people to elect the president. And then he says, but there's a problem with that. There are two problems with that. The first problem is that the right to vote differs from state to state. So if the people collectively elect the president, then the states which allow more people to vote are going to have more political power. For example, Massachusetts has no requirement for voting in 1787 except that you be 21 years old and a male citizen. All right, there are no religious requirements, no property requirements, no residence requirements other than that you be a citizen in Massachusetts. South Carolina, on the opposite end, requires that you be a male head of household owning a significant amount of land and be white. In South Carolina, the vote is very small, and somebody could be the 25-year-old son of a very wealthy planter, but still living at home. The 25-year-old son can't vote because he's not head of household. All right. So the voting is very different from state to state. New Jersey in 1787 allows women to vote. Nobody else does. So Madison says one of the problems is we have a direct election of the president. Some states are going to have more power than others. But one could imagine that that's not that difficult to fix. They could have said, they could have, for example, had universal adult male suffrage or something like that. But then Madison says the big problem, the real problem is that if we elect the president by the popular vote, he says, our Negroes won't count. And what, of course, he means by our Negroes won't count is slaves don't vote. So Virginia is the largest state by population, but it has the second largest white population because 40% of the state are slaves. South Carolina is 50% slaves. North Carolina is probably 30 to 35% slaves. So if you are collecting all the votes, these very large southern states are at a disadvantage because so many of their people are prohibited from voting because they are considered property, not people. And so they come up with the Electoral College, which says that every state is assigned a certain number of electors based on their representation in Congress, 2 senators and members of the House based on population. But the convention had already agreed that the House seats would be determined by counting the whole number of free people and 3/5 of the slaves. So, for example, in the very first presidential election, the best estimate is, and then I have a question for Regina, that between 4 and 6 presidential electors from Virginia in 1792 are created simply because they counted slaves for purposes of representation. The slaves, of course, don't vote, but Virginia gets the political power of counting slaves at 3/5 in electing the president. So the Electoral College is, in fact, put in there as a pro-slavery device to guarantee that the southern states are going to have a better chance of electing the president. One delegate at the convention actually gets up and says the reason Virginia will oppose a direct election of the president is because they won't get to elect Virginians because they won't have the voting power of their slaves. So it's very open. It's completely out there and discussed. Regina, question.
Quick question, Regina. Has there ever been any move to simplify or standardize the primary process nationally?
There has never been a move to standard. Well, there have been movements to standardize the primary system. That is, political reformers are always saying we should have a standard primary system. But because elections are effectively run by the states with the within general rules passed by the National Congress, it's never happened. Okay, so we have this Electoral College. So every state gets a minimum of 3 electors, 1 for each of their senators, and 1, if they only have 1 representative, then they get 3. And this leads to a bizarrely unfair electoral system. Let me give you an example, okay? California, with 37 million people, constitutes about 12.5% of the United States population. California will have 55 presidential electors in the next election. There are 538 electors. California gets 55. However, if California got 12% of the electors, California would get 66 electors, not 55. Because by giving 2 electors to every state based on their senators, what we have is a system that skews in favor of tiny little states. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, all of which, by the way, have populations smaller than Saskatchewan, they get 3 electors because they get the 2 senators, even though they have incredibly tiny populations. Wyoming is, like 0.2% of the United States. It would get 1 elector maybe if it was based on merely a factor of the population. So what we have is a very skewed system where the smaller states are disproportionately more powerful. If you were a political strategist and you're thinking about how much advertising do I have to spend to get an electoral vote? Because there are people who think about this, right? There are people in the Trump and the Clinton campaign, certainly in the Clinton campaign. I'm not sure what they're thinking about in the Trump campaign, to be very honest, because they're not running any kind of normal campaign. But the Clinton campaign is saying, if we spend X amount of dollars in Iowa, we are likely to pick up the Iowa electoral votes. And those electoral votes will cost us so much per dollar. Now, I'm not saying they're buying votes. What I'm saying is that the advertising, the campaigning will lead to this outcome. So if you did that, what you might conclude is that you can pick up a lot of electoral votes for very little money by targeting Wyoming or Montana because there aren't very many media markets. You only have to hit a couple of places hard, and media is cheap. You can buy, 5 minutes of time on the Helena, Montana TV station for a lot less than you can buy 5 seconds in New York City. So the calculation is that and because of the overrepresentation in the small states, they have an advantage. The other side of this is that, with the exception of 2 states, every state has passed a law saying that the person who wins the state gets all the electoral votes. And this is also a kind of a very weird notion. So that you could win 49% of the 36 or 37 million people in California and not get a single electoral vote because all the electoral votes went to the person who won 50.1% of the electoral votes. So we end up with this crazy system where in 2000, Al Gore has more than 600,000 votes. He has about 650,000 more votes than George Bush at the popular level, but he doesn't win the Electoral College majority, and so he's not elected president, and George Bush is elected president, even though no one would doubt that George Bush did not have a popular majority. He didn't. This is not the first time this has taken place. Now, I suppose in theory that could happen in Canada as well. That is, it would be theoretically possible for a candidate to, but it would be much harder to calculate, because what you have to do is do every single riding, right? And figure out how many people voted for the Liberal, how many people voted for the Conservative candidate, total up all of those votes, and then, across the whole country, and whoa, you come to the conclusion that more people voted for Conservative members of Parliament than voted for Liberals, but Trudeau got in because he carried more seats. I think, though, Ken tells me this has never happened in Canada. And I suspect that it's unlikely to happen because of the very nature of the system. The other thing about the U.S. is I've done the calculation. The 15 largest states in the United States constitute just under a majority of the Electoral College. That is, if you win the 15 largest states, you are within 4 electoral votes of being elected president. It would be possible to, let's suppose a candidate wins the 15 largest states by an 80% majority in every state, which means that candidate has won 60 or 70% of the votes in the country. And the other candidate wins the smaller states by a 51 to 49 majority. The other candidate who now has maybe 35% of the popular vote, gets elected president because of the nature of the electoral college. Now that's theoretically possible. It's never going to happen. Something like that could not happen because, for one thing, because the largest states don't always agree. I mean, Texas votes very differently than California, for example. But what we have is this crazy system where the person with the most votes doesn't necessarily get elected president, and the voters feel effectively disfranchised because of the system. I lived in Oklahoma for 7 years, and Oklahoma is perhaps the most Republican state in the United States. It gave George W. Bush a larger majority than Texas gave him. He was the former governor of Texas. They knew him better, so he didn't have such a large majority there. But he carried Oklahoma with like 65% of the vote. Right? There's no point in voting in Oklahoma if you're a Democrat, because the Republican's going to win. Whereas if you had a national popular vote, then your vote would count no matter what state you were in. You got a question from Regina?
Question and observation. In 1979 in Canada, Joe Clark and the Conservatives, Progressive Conservatives, were elected with fewer votes than the Liberals.
Okay.
The Liberals got about 80% of the vote in Quebec, and the Conservatives won with the rest of the country.
So the
popular vote.
Okay, all right.
So just
Good to know.
I was incorrect before. The question from Regina was, why are Ohio and Florida so instrumental in American elections?
Okay, the reason Ohio and Florida are instrumental is because Florida is tied with New York as the third largest state, the third largest number of presidential electors, 29. Both New York and Florida have 29 electors. And Ohio is about 7th in this list. So they are large chunks of presidential electors. If you carry Ohio and Florida, you go into the election with a big chunk of electors of the number that you need to be elected. All right, so that makes them very important. The other large states tend to be more predictable. That is, New York has not voted for a Republican for president since Ronald Reagan's first term, or since Ronald Reagan's second term. Okay? California has not voted for a Republican since Ronald Reagan's second term. Massachusetts has not voted for a Republican since Ronald Reagan's second term. Illinois has consistently been Democratic since the Reagan administration. So the result is, when you look at the electoral map, the Democrats pretty much know they have New York, California, Illinois, and Massachusetts locked up. Similarly, the Republicans know they have Texas locked up. They probably have Georgia locked up, which is a pretty big state. They probably have Arizona locked up. And so when they look to see where are they going to get the 270 electoral votes they need to be elected president, the two biggest chunks that are often in contention are Florida and Ohio. So you campaign a lot in Florida, you campaign a lot in Ohio. Florida is essentially two separate countries. There is South Florida, which is heavily Hispanic and heavily populated by northerners who have migrated to Florida to settle. Tends to be highly Democratic. North Florida, traditionally Southern conservative, and tends to be heavily Republican. So you have this diversity in Florida. Same thing in Ohio. Northern Ohio is heavily Democratic. Cleveland, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, big industrial cities. Central Ohio is rural farming, very Republican. Southern Ohio is mixed. Some of it's very Republican, some of it's very Democratic. So there's a contest in Ohio. Same thing in Florida. Same thing. By the way, the news media tells you it's the same thing in Pennsylvania. But if you look at the results, the last time Pennsylvania voted for a Republican was Reagan. So again, Pennsylvania is not nearly as contested as we think. Any more questions from Regina? Any more questions from anybody? We got 15 minutes. Yes?
Is the national popular vote what Madison meant when he said the fittest way to elect?
All right, okay, so the national popular vote. What Madison was saying is the most appropriate thing would be for the people to elect the president, and that would be the national popular vote. Now, so when you watch the election results, you're going to see two tickers. You're going to see popular vote, you know, so-and-so's got so much, and it's always changing numbers, and then you're going to see electoral vote. And you're going to see the news commentators call the states. They're going to say, New York is going for Clinton. Well, that's no surprise, you know. Alabama just went for Trump. That's no surprise. And when Alabama goes for Trump, Alabama's 9 electoral votes will be added to Trump's column. And all that matters is the electoral votes. The popular vote doesn't matter except for political legitimacy, which is very important. Because obviously, had it not been for 9/11, George W. Bush would have had 4 years where he was considered to be completely illegitimate, and he probably would have been defeated the next time around. But it's hard to unseat a president in the middle of a war, and the illegitimacy of George Bush was forgotten when America had to unite after 9/11. So there is a movement in the U.S. called the National Popular Vote Movement. National Popular Vote Movement is to get enough states to pass a state law which says that their presidential electors will vote for the person who has the largest popular vote, no matter how the state did. So, for example, New York has passed the National Popular Vote bill. The bill goes into effect when states constituting 60% of the Electoral College support it. In other words, it doesn't go into effect just because New York's going to.
So that's population?
Pardon?
Population?
No. Well, okay. When states which represent 60% of the total Electoral College have passed the National Popular Vote bill, all right? That would be states of constituting about 300 electoral votes. It's going to be like, say, 22, 23 states if they're big ones, okay? So when all of those states have passed the National Popular Vote law, the law says that the electors in those states will vote for the person who wins the most votes nationally, not the person who wins the state. So, for example, California and New York have passed the National Popular Vote law. Let us suppose 10 years from now, you have your 60% of the Electoral College value among the states. The bill goes into effect. There's an election. California votes for the Democrat, and the majority of the American people vote for the Republican. The California electors would be required to vote for the Republican because that person won the national popular vote. That would kill the Electoral College. But it's a very complicated process, and there has to be a certain amount of trust. You know, because what happens if the day before the electoral vote, California changes its law? You know, I mean, there has to be a certain amount of trust that it would actually come into play. Other questions?
Well, there was a question from Regina, which I think you partly answered.
Okay.
Has there been a desire in the U.S. to move away from the Electoral College in choosing a president? Would it require a constitutional amendment?
Well, the most secure way of doing it would require a constitutional amendment. That is, you have passed a constitutional amendment saying the Electoral College is hereby abolished. The president is elected by the person who gets the person elected president is the person who has the most popular votes during the election. The problem with the constitutional amendment is that it requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states, and to ratify it. And when you are thinking about a constitutional amendment, members of state legislatures, which have to ratify it, are always thinking about what is in my best interest, as well as maybe what's in the nation's best interest. So it's very difficult to ratify a constitutional amendment. Imagine that you are in the North Dakota legislature and you're trying to decide whether you want to abolish the Electoral College, and and somebody comes along and says, well, you know, North Dakota gets $4 million in extra advertising revenue every 4 years. Nobody's going to be campaigning for our votes in a national election because there aren't enough people here. All the money's going to go to where there are lots of people, big cities. So some small states might say, we don't want the national popular vote. On the other hand, some big states might say, hey, California's the biggest dog, in the fight, and we want to keep it that way. So I don't see any likelihood of this happening anytime soon. The one caveat to that would be if we had 2 or 3 presidential elections in a row where the person losing the popular vote gets elected president, and it's on both parties so that there's no more partisanship. I mean, if you're a Republican right now, you would be opposed to the national popular vote because the prognosis for Republicans is that they cannot put together an a popular majority. This votes simply aren't there. I mean, when you have a party that has for 10 years campaigned against various segments of the population, you realize these people aren't going to vote. I'll give you one interesting example of this. In 2008, 49% of the people who consider themselves to be heterosexual voted for Obama, and 49% of the people who consider themselves heterosexual voted for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney lost the popular vote by about 5 million votes. Where did those 5 million votes come from? Well, they came from virtually every gay and lesbian in the United States who voted against Mitt Romney because the Republican Party made war on gay people for more than a decade. And if you were a Republican strategist sitting around looking at the vote, they would say, we have 2 choices. We either can change our position and stop being homophobic bigots, or we can continue to get our butt kicked in every election because in a close election, there's a 5 million vote block that's going to vote against us. There's a group called the Log Cabin Republicans who are gay Republicans, and they have like 15 members as far as I can tell. And they actually walked out of the Republican convention this year because they said that the platform was so anti-gay that they had to walk out of it. Similarly, when you have a candidate like Donald Trump who is saying he wants to expel 15 million undocumented aliens, large numbers of whom are taxpayers and married to American citizens and have American citizens who are children, and of those 15 million undocumented, probably 12 million are Hispanic. You have to believe that the 20 or 30 million people of Hispanic ancestry in the United States are not going to go rush to vote for the Republican Party, because essentially the party has a platform which says, we plan to make war on you. Similarly, when you have a political party that since the 1980s has persistently demanded that abortion be made illegal, you have to assume that a significant number of women in the United States are never going to vote for the Republican, even if, as all the polls show, most Americans say, and by the way, the polls are overwhelming. Most Americans think abortion should be legal, and then most Americans say, I don't want to have an abortion, and I don't like abortion. Those two are not inconsistent. So when you put the numbers together, it's very difficult to see how the Republicans put together a popular majority. Now, Trump may change this, but I don't think so. Anyhow, that's yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that you thought that Gary Johnson and the Libertarian Party might have a chance of taking a few states.
Yeah, Gary Johnson is the Libertarian, and as a Libertarian, he is sort of in and out of both sides of the political spectrum. On one hand, he's in favor of legalizing marijuana, which makes him a Trudeau liberal, right? And on the other hand, he believes in abolishing all health care at the state and federal level, which means he's Darth Vader. And, Gary Johnson most recently said that we should abolish all federal and state aid to college students, that they should pay for it themselves like he did. Well, I guess, his daddy had more money than mine. And so, he's on both sides. I listened to Gary Johnson give a speech, and I thought, there's about 40% of what he's saying that actually makes a great deal of sense and is fairly rational, and I agree with it. There's about 20% of what he's saying that I think I completely disagree with, but I could understand that somebody else might agree with. And there was about 40% that sounded like he lived on the moon. Okay, but there's a very good chance he'll take Utah. Utah is, of course, the home of the Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, the Mormons. It's a very politically conservative state. The last Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, is a Mormon who has declared that he will not vote for Trump. He's opposed to Trump. He's now back living in Utah. And it is possible that you will have a very, very tight three-way race in which hardcore Republicans will vote for Johnson, Democrats will vote for Clinton, and they're going to be 35, 40, there'll be maybe 40% of the state, maybe 35. And it's possible Johnson kind of sneaks in, in a tight three-way race because of the religious factor and the sort of Mormon argument that you can't be a good Mormon and vote for a man who has Donald Trump's values towards marriage and women and sex and everything else. I mean, you can't be a morally religious person and vote for a guy who says he's like to have sex with his daughter, except he can't because he's her father. I mean, that kind of position really undermines him. The same thing might be true in New Mexico, where Gary Johnson was governor. There's not a huge Mormon community there, but again, and by the way, if Johnson carries Utah, it is a gigantic blow to the Republican Party, because the last time Utah voted for a Democrat was 1964. When Lyndon Johnson won. So there's a real possibility of interesting things. Stay tuned, and I would say, just to hedge your bets, buy a little bit of stock in a brick company. Got time for one more question?
No, we don't actually. Unfortunately, you can maybe ask quickly. Apologies to Regina. We're really sorry that the sound system sort of didn't work. We need to get some email questions through. We'll fix it up sort of for next time. Paul is actually running from here to go to a master's thesis defense from Ontario, which is why we had to stop sort of right now. I think we're going to bring Paul back over here for an informal conversation after the election, so he can explain all of the things he got wrong today, because everybody in America is getting everything wrong about American politics right now. Paul's a wonderful analyst of the American political system on your behalf. I'd like to thank him for the presentation today. Thank you very much, Regina, for being part of this whole process. Enjoy the election. I hope you can understand it a little bit more now. At the end of Paul's presentation, basically tells you how absurd it is, how historic it is, how it's tied into a long-standing constitutional history of the United States. But on your behalf, and Regina as well, join me in thanking Paul Finkelman.
And I want to make my prediction, because he said I'll come back and tell you everything. I predict that almost certainly either Trump or Clinton will be elected president.
Thanks, everybody.